Okay, hi everyone. We are going to do a procedural roads, procedural sort of streetscape workflow today. So this is just a bunch of lines that are driving a block makeup. So I can move these around and they will update. I will talk about the fact that the top one doesn't update. It's because I'm using a new tool by Max called retopology. So for this task, we need two cool plugins that are available online. You'll need to make yourself an i2. i2 make really great a really great product called Forest Pro, which is lovely for plants and scattering them across sites. And you will need to make an account and go to the forums, because the SplineOffset tool that they've got on their website at the moment is for 2021. So just go to the forum and you'll find the 2022 version. The other one that you need is Max Clanky's beautiful Greeble script, and you'll just need to come into here to 2022, download the 2022 one. And the other one you will need is the Autodesk app. So if you open this on your machine and go to 3ds Max, you'll see Autodesk retopology tools. So you will just need to update that. Be very, very careful that if you have 2022, make sure that you are updating to the retopology tools for 2022. I have had some trouble in terms of licensing when I selected to download a 2021 version. So once they're downloaded, you can go into your Max and into your Customize and into your Configure user and system paths and into your third-party plugins, and you will need to add a folder location where you have put both those DLL files. So for me, I'm not going inside the application. I am going into the users of the C drive. So users, just into my own, and I've got it in there because that way any additional DLLs or MS files that I have, I can keep putting them into there. So once you've given yourself a new location, just restart Max to get them to be visible. So what I'm going to do is actually just start all of this again. And I realized I made a mistake up here, so I need to come into, and I should always do this anyway, into my unit setup, into my system unit setup, and just make sure that you're working in meters or whatever is appropriate for your project. So, and I liked my display unit scale to be the same as my system unit scale. Okay, so I'm going to come over here and create some splines. I'm going to make a rectangle that is 1000 by 1000. So just, you can use tab to jump between those windows. And just while it's selected, I am going to right click on my spinner to bring that to 0, 0, 0. Because it's much easier to work that way in Max. Now, what I want to do here is I want to make a lot of referenced copies of things. So with this rectangle selected, what I am able to do is I can clone it, or I can actually rename it here as well. So just need to click on it twice, and I will call it driver base. And while it's selected, I'm going to come up here and make myself a new layer. And I'm going to call that new layer driver splines. And you'll see why in a minute, but this driver splines, which I've already made before here, but this set of driver splines will be what we use to drive our whole city. Okay, so in top view, just pressing T for top view, I can now come across here, and knowing that driver splines is active, which is really useful, I can draw in a few splines. So I'm using the Beziers, which is fine, and as we know, roads in cities are generally a little bit, use the word heterogeneous, but you will get a road hierarchy in cities. So you'll have some wide ones and you'll have some less wide ones. So these 3 roads, I want to make these my 30-metre roads. So I will rename these 30, but as Max likes to have every individual item have a unique name, it's a really good idea to make sure that you can see that unique identifier in this layer. So I've got 3 30-metre roads, and then I'm also going to come in and make some lines that are going to be my thinner roads, and they don't need to intersect, which is good. And you'll see when you edit them how useful that is. I won't do too many. Alright, so if I then want to take these lines, and I will make these roads 15 metres. So, yep, just make that 1, 2. Great. Okay, so now what we've got is our driver splines. Just escape out of there, and this is why this one's got its edits on, but we can turn that off there. And we want to take the 30-metre ones, and we're going to select them all together and right click and clone, and we want to do a reference clone, and those names are fine for the moment, but you can see they're all grey, so they're highlighted here, grey over here, so I can add them to a new layer straight away. And I'm going to call this layer the casements, and casements is the word used to describe roads, or the sort of the internal bits of roads between property line and property line. So we're about to kind of we're going to make those casements. And the 15-metre roads I can put onto the same layer. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing, clone as a reference, and OK. And while they're still highlighted like that, I am going to pull them into this casement layer. Selecting them and sticking them up there. So now we'll use our spline offset tool. So you'll notice that when I click on one of these lines, I'm not getting the grey reference line, but when I click on these ones, I'm getting the reference line. So for the moment, I'm going to turn off the driver splines, and I'm just going to work with these referenced copies. So selecting those 4 15-metre ones, if I come over here to my modifiers, and because I've got a lot of modifiers, I want to type in spline offset as quickly as I can, which I never can type in quickly enough, but SplineO because there's no gap between the spline offset. So you need to type it all in. When it comes in, it will look a bit funny. I can adjust the distance here to be 15, so that will give me a 15-meter street. You know, I could have plenty of parallels here, but I don't only want the one. And I need, in this circumstance, an open butt, and I don't want to keep my original splines. So those are my 15-meter streets. I can do exactly the same thing to my 30-meter streets. So I can select them all here, or I can select them all over here, and I do my spline offset. And in this circumstance, I want to make that distance 30 meters. And we can do open butt. Don't keep the original. We won't heal the intersections within the spline offset. We'll do that in a shape boolean. So now that we've got our casements, we need another referenced copy of these casements so that we can come back to these whenever we like. You can do all this, of course, without referenced copies, but the referenced copies just mean that you've got a bit more control in terms of making adjustments, you know, to road widths or locations. So if I hold down Shift and select all of those and right click and clone and reference and OK, I can then make a new layer which I would call my shape boolean. So that's what we're going to use to make our road. So shape bool. One of the other things that we need is we need the driver base. So so we need a clone of that one as well. And these also need to be a referenced clone. So not technically, but that's going to be better if they are. So clone again, and we'll call it a reference copy. And while we have that referenced copy up there, we can just drag that one into the shape boolean layer. So what we will do now is use that as the basis, that shape base, this base rectangle. That will be the basis of our shape booleans. So what we want to do first is I can turn these back off, our driver splines, and just work with these as a shape boolean. So coming over to our compound objects under splines, we have our compound shapes, and we have the shape boolean under there, which is a reasonably recent feature, and it's really quite exciting. It's very much like a traditional boolean or pro boolean. So you add you set what type of parameter you want. So you want an intersect, and you want to add operands. So we can go ahead and making sure our casements, oh, actually our casements aren't turned off, so I'm going to turn off my add operands for a second and just make sure my casements are off, because I want to only be working with the objects that I want in my shape boolean. So selecting that again, and as you can see, it's already turned itself into a shape boolean. So now we want to subtract. I want to use the subtract tool, and we will subtract our roads. So just going through and selecting each of those. And that gives us, it's a really, and then holster the add operands, because you don't want to have it keep on going. So what that could be is, that could be your casements. So you might imagine that this edge here is your the edge, your building edge. So we can clone this a couple of times and use it in a couple of different ways. The first clone we might make would be to offset it for footpaths. So I would just right click and clone, and I would again do a reference. It's all referenced copies, which is kind of what's interesting. And we would call this the footpaths. And you can simply just add another spline offset on that. If I could ever spell it correctly. So that spline offset is becoming the footpath. You could reduce the distance here. I don't know. You don't want to reduce it to 2.5, which is what our normal footpaths are out in the world, but probably 4 is as narrow as you'd want to go. And down at the bottom here, we can make the bevel type a round, and that'll give you a nice, you know, footpathy looking thing. Actually, we could even not keep the original spline in this circumstance, because that will just give us the footpath edge. And then we could actually run a sweep along that footpath edge if we wanted to. So going back to this driver base, we could clone this again as a reference, and we might call this one, well, maybe you would call this one the blocks, or buildings if you wanted to. And this is the one that we will use Max Clanky's Greeble on. And there's a bunch of different ways that we can use that Greeble, which we'll go through some of them in this video. Yeah, we'll take this one that is our builds, and we can add a quantify mesh to that. And you might just want to press your F3 so that you can see your faces. That doesn't look too bad, but essentially it sort of thinks that all through there is building, so this might be less of a problem of my quads and more of a problem of my design. Let's try 8%, so we're getting slightly better looking stuff, but really through here I should probably add more streets because it's too deep a block to actually make that work. Now I can do this whole process just using quantify mesh, and it's really, it updates more happily, but if I use the retopology after the quantify mesh in here, you can see that it sort of gives you a better result. So on top of the quantify mesh, I can go into my modifiers and add my Greeble. So if I just type Gree, it should show up, and you'll get a Greeble happening over the blocks with a footpath in between. Now Greeble is Greeble. It's made for doing a Death Star, but you can also, you don't have to have the panels, so you could bring this down to 0 and 0. And you could also bring the taper down to 0, and then just use the widgets if you wanted to sort of make a more industrial looking landscape. And that's, you know, more density, less density. So you've got quite a bit of play in terms of how they work. If I were to go back to my driver splines at this point, we would be able to make modifications to this road that would instantly update. So if I'm coming back into this line, you'll see that as I move around, the whole thing moves with me. If I am ready, I guess, you know, if I've really set my streetscape, I'm really happy with it, I think it's worthwhile coming into the building layer, and in here, under the modifiers, you could add your retopology. So that's the retopology there. And retopology does need to know how many faces it's going to compute. So I can just press 7 on the keyboard, and if I do that, that will show me, well, in my circumstance, it shows me the amount of polys that builds has in it. Now it's counting all of the Greeble retopology, so you can see if I pull that retopology underneath Greeble that the polys there go down. Yeah, go down if I turn my Greeble off. Your poly count will actually be set to the entire scene, so you might just want to come to your plus and come to your configure viewports, and if you come to statistics you can make it just show you selection instead. I find that more useful. So with the topology, I'm going to turn that Greeble back off again. With the topology, you want to look at that and go, okay, it's 186 polys. I find that you want to have around about the same amount of polys in here. And then if you compute that, oh, actually I should just actually go into, it'll think about it for a little bit. So actually that took longer than expected, and I think that the result is also a little bit weird because the Greeble appears on when it's turned off. So when you run your retopology, it's probably worthwhile making sure that you run it, either just remove your Greeble first, and probably I need to rerun that retopology, and then put Greeble on top of that. So that is one way to do it. I think I might just show, well, let's run the retopology again so we can have a look at what it does. There's a whole bunch of settings in retopology, but reform really is sort of the nicest. And we know that we've got about 180. Might try and push it down to 140 and see what the difference is. And yeah, much faster this time. And you can see that we have nice quads, and you could sort of play between the quadify mesh and the retopology. You know, potentially you could bring that quad size up and then recompute your retopology. So maybe you would recompute that. Let's see if that makes a difference. Yeah, makes a little bit of a difference. And then we could put our Greeble on top of that. If you wanted to have some space between these objects, there's a couple of ways, I guess, to use Greeble. So you could have a Greeble, you can have multiple Greebles on top of one another. So you might turn off your widgets, and you could have your first Greeble at 0. So you might go 0, 0, and then you might turn up your taper. Might give you some space, I think, yeah. So this would give you some space between the buildings, so you're almost using the taper in a kind of a flat way. And then you could put a Greeble on top of that. So we would then, let's do that in F3. Before you put a Greeble on top of a Greeble though, do be careful, which is something I didn't just do. You need to select tops so that it only Greebles on top of what is selected. Otherwise it's Greebling all over, trying to Greeble all over the sides as well. So that'll give you some space between the buildings. Of course, buildings in our world are not really tapered, so your second Greeble you might not taper. You could also use this second Greeble as a kind of a retail podium level. So you might go that the minimum height on this one is 5 and maybe 10. And you might also turn the widgets off this one. And something that you can do here is because that level is likely to have more glass, you could set the material ID to something else. In this case, I will set it to 3 because by default the widgets have material 2 on them. So let's just do that for a moment, and we could put another Greeble on top of that, and that one could be our much taller towers. So you might have a minimum of except of course remembering to select tops. So select tops, and then that Greeble will sit on top of that. So that way you can, lots of height if you want to. So that's a fairly chunky city. That's one way that if you had that kind of intensity that you can do. If you wanted to have only part of it have different sort of types of city on it, you'd probably have to come all the way back down to the retopology, and you'd probably have to put an edit poly within there in order to be able to select some. So if you type in ED, edit poly will turn up. You can come to the faces or the polygons. It doesn't have to be edit poly, it can be I think it can be a mesh select. But what you'll see is that if I just select some of those and then turn on my show end result, it's only going to show up on some of those on those selected faces. So it's pretty good. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to work with Greeble in that way. And in terms of making the footpath, oh, just wrecked it because I deselected. Should remember, yeah. Oh, so if you are in Edit Poly and you deselect whilst you are in Edit Poly, you can see everything, all of my faces are deselected. So if I select some different faces now and hold down Control, it'll just do the greebling on those selected faces. But I need to come back up here. What we can do with the footpath is you could work with it in a couple of different ways, but because I got rid of the internal line, I didn't keep the original spline, and if I was to press this isolate button, what I've really got is the full blocks, so I probably have to just use the extrude on that. I think sweep won't work. We could try it. So sweep allows you to push sort of a profile along a line. In this case it's doing an angle, but you'd probably just use a bar, and you would change these to 0.2 or something, 0.2. So yeah, depending on how you've made it, sweep or extrude could work. Yeah, which is completely fine. And that one, I guess, this would also be able to be used as a spline that you drive a bunch of street trees along, and a bunch of other things. So there are other ways to work with this in 3D. This is very much a this one is very much a flat works best on a flat. It can have some problems in terms of when you work 3D. But anyway, thank you for joining me, and I hope that explains things about a kind of procedural city model. Thank you.